Hi, this is Josh. Today we are going to look at an introduction to improvisation. We're going to start off with a very simple arrangement of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. We are going to experiment with a few interesting ideas to make this plain sounding arrangement into something that is more interesting. The goal of this tutorial is to introduce you to the concept of improvisation so that you could grab these ideas and apply it on the songs that you're learning. We have a single note melody of Twinkle that is harmonized by some simple chords on the left hand. Let's first give that a listen. What we heard was pretty basic. It had a simple melody, and when you want to learn a song, you start off by learning the melody and try to harmonize it with some chords. Now, how can we make this more interesting by improvisation? So, what is improvisation? You could look at it as a way to enhance or embellish or add some more details or to make the song more spicy. So, how do we do it? So, before we look at this from the perspective of music, let's consider an example of a painting. We could have a very simple painting of somebody dancing. As you could see in this example, this is a stick figure of somebody dancing. So, the song that you learn will be a basic form in which the melody is recognizable with the chords that you use to harmonize it. But that doesn't mean that everybody that learns to play the song has to play it exactly the same way. You could improvise by either adding more details or adding more style to it, which comes from your own interpretation of it. Two different artists could choose to do things in completely different ways and yet end up with things that are still interesting. And the changes that you make might drift away from the original material and become heavily influenced by your own ideas. So these concepts also apply when you play music. And the more you know about the song and the more theory that you know about the music that you're playing helps you to improvise and make your improvisations sound good. The more experienced you are and the more time you spend improvising, you'll tend to develop the ideas that you can use to make the song sound in your own style. Today, the version of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star that we saw was like an empty canvas. We're going to use that as our base, and we're going to look at three different ideas that we're going to apply on this. And we could see that even with just these three different ideas, there are so many different ways that you could improvise. And the trick is to make the improvisations not sound so repetitive or predictable. The ideas that I'll be discussing today are from the book called Improvising the Right Way for the Accordion. Although this book was written for the accordion, the techniques that are discussed here are applicable to pretty much any instrument or even for your vocals. This book focuses on improvising by writing down the notes. And I find this as a very effective way for beginners to get started on improvisation. That is mainly because when you watch an advanced musician improvising on a song, it's all too fast and fleeting, and you're not able to like observe what exactly is going on, and at times that could be intimidating. By writing things down and slowing it down and focusing on it makes you understand what exactly is going on. You could take your own time and work it out, and try to do things and experiment and try to see what works for you and what doesn't work. The three ideas that I learned from this book are two types of reiteration and one type of insertion. So, without further ado, we're going to be looking at the first type of reiteration. So, reiteration means repetition of a note. You could apply this whenever there's a note that is longer. By doing this, we are adding some new rhythmic variations of the sound. So in this example, you could see that we have half notes. So it's just two measures. We have two C's and two D's, and all of these are half notes. So in order to do reiteration or repetition of these half notes, I've replaced each of the half notes by 4 different eighth notes. So the two C's have been replaced by 4 eighth notes each, which gives you 8 C's in the first measure, and we have 8 D's in the second measure. Let's go and listen to how this sounds like. That's 4 long notes, 2 C's and 2 D's. And now let's listen to the reiterated notes, where we're just gonna have faster repetitions of the same notes. Okay, now let's go and try this out on the Twinkle Twinkle Little Star that we saw at the beginning of the video. Applying reiteration the way that we saw in the example sounds pretty straightforward here. We have a bunch of half notes and a few whole notes in there. Let's replace all of these notes by eighth notes and see how it sounds like. Okay, let's stop there. I think you get the idea. The song definitely sounds different. There's more going on compared to how we were playing those longer notes that we were holding down. But it doesn't sound that interesting because it sounds too repetitive. It feels like we're overdoing it, and it's very predictable. So to fix this, let's go back and change some of these notes so that we don't play all of them as eighth notes, but we'll be mixing it up with eighth notes, half notes, and quarter notes, and make the pattern a little bit less repetitive. So on the top we have the predictable version of reiteration, where every half note was converted into 4 eighth notes. So in the bottom, what we're doing is we're either taking 4 eighth notes and making a half note, or taking 2 eighth notes and making it a quarter note, or leaving the eighth notes as is. On the first measure, we can see that we made the first 4 eighth notes into a half note, and the next 4 eighth notes have been converted into a quarter note and 2 eighth notes. And the second measure is actually a mirror image of what we did in the first image. So we have the first two eighth notes and then a quarter and then a half. The third measure, we are reverting things back to two half notes. So this is exactly the same as the original version with no improvisations added. And this is something that we'll be doing quite a bit because we don't have to improvise every measure and change everything. So we'd still be keeping certain parts of the song untouched. One thing that I like to do, and I've also observed like other musicians do, is when there are phrases that are repeating. If like the same phrase repeats after itself, the first time you play it, you play the really simple plain version of it, and then when it repeats, you play an improvised version of it in which you decorate it with repetitions or insertions. As you might have already noticed, this is not the only way you could arrange half, quarter, and eighth notes. You could try out your own combinations and get like different results. But let's see how this sounds like. Let's see if this makes it sound any less repetitive. I like what I heard. It's not as repetitive as last time, and at the same time, it's not as plain as the original. Now that we looked at the first type of reiteration, let's look at the second type of reiteration. The second type is also a repetition of slower, longer notes, but in this type of repetition, instead of repeating one note, we are trying to look at a movement from one note to another that is long and slow, and we are replicating that movement using shorter, faster movements. So in this example, we see that there is a C to D movement in the first measure and a G to F movement in the second measure. And both these movements are half notes. So what we could do is to replace these half notes by eighth notes, but instead of replacing the C with four eighth notes, we're going to be replacing the C with eighth notes that go C, D, C, D. So we're kind of interleaving the eighth notes to look at the movement that is happening in the measure, and we are trying to repeat that movement several times by reiterating. And similarly, in the second measure, we have two half notes that go from G to F. So instead of reiterating it as G, 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 F, 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 we're doing an eighth note pattern of G, F, G, F, G, F, G, F. And let's see how we could apply this to the second line of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Now we're looking at the second line, which is also a bunch of half notes followed by a whole note in the last measure. So this is the line that goes, how I wonder what you are. And let's see how we can apply the type 2 reiteration here. So this is a little different from the example that we looked at for the illustration of type 2 reiteration, where the movement was actually between the two half notes in the same measure. But over here we see that the same note F is repeated as two half notes in the first measure, and then we have two E's. So the movement is between F and E, and we're using quarter note reiterations here just to mix this up a little bit. So if you look at the first measure, we are trying to reiterate the movement from F to E by doing a quarter note motion of F, E, F, E. And in the second measure, we are trying to capture the movement between the E to D from measures 2 to 3 on the top. So we're doing E, D, E, D. And on the third measure, we are just doing our type 1 reiteration again for the D. And in the last measure, we're doing the type 1 reiteration again on the whole note. So with just two types of reiterations that we learned right now, we are already getting creative by mixing and matching the two techniques. And let's give this a listen and see how it sounds like. So at first, we're listening to the unchanged version of line 2. And now with the improvisations added in. Okay, that's coming along pretty nice. And let's move over to the next two lines. And in the next two lines, you could see that there is a repetition of a phrase. The two lines are identical. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. So those are exactly the same notes, G, G, F, F, E, E, D, which is repeated twice in consecutive lines. So right now we're gonna not add any improvisations on the first time that these notes show up, and when we play the repetition of it on the second line, we're gonna be adding the new type of improvisation that we're gonna look at next. So next up we have a note insertion technique, and this technique is so cool. It's gonna make your song sound so amazing, and this is one of my favorite improvisation techniques. So by note insertion, what we mean is that we're gonna insert a note that doesn't exist, a value of a note. So previously when we did reiteration, all the changes that we did was just to repeat the exact same note. The only change that was done was rhythmic. But right now we're doing melodic changes by adding notes that don't exist in the original melody. And this particular instance of note insertion is called a chromatic note insertion, and this is also a single chromatic note insertion. By that, what we mean is that we are only gonna add one extra chromatic note. So by chromatic, what we mean, if you're not already familiar with the term, is a note that is exactly a half step away from the note that we are working with. So for example, if we are working with C, the chromatic intervals from C are C sharp if you want to go a half step up, or B if you want to go a half step down. So in this example, we see that the first measure is a whole note with a C in it, and the second measure is a D with another whole note in it. So this is a great example of a place where we could do a chromatic single note insertion. So in order to do a chromatic single note insertion, the two notes that we are working with should be apart by a whole step. So a whole step is two half steps or two chromatic intervals. So C to D is separated by two half steps, which is C to C sharp and C sharp to D. So the same could be applied if we have a movement from, say, F to G, where the chromatic interval between the two notes would be an F sharp. So in this case, what we're going to do is to add a C sharp before we move to the D after playing the C. But we're not just going to do that, we're also going to add some of the changes that we saw using the reiteration technique. So we're going to break this whole C note into a bunch of smaller or shorter C notes, and the final time we play that C, we're gonna replace that with a C sharp. The chromatic addition that we do here, which is a C sharp, is called a passing tone. So we call this a passing tone because we are moving from C to D, and we are temporarily passing through the C sharp. So when we do that, we have to make sure that we're not playing that C sharp as a long note. So we don't really want to split this whole note C into two half notes and playing the second half note as a C sharp. That would be too long for a passing note. So ideally we want to play something like an eighth note at the end of the first measure, that is a C sharp, and we quickly resolve to a D. So at the bottom we have the result of the improvisation. We've broken down the whole note in the first measure into a half note, a quarter note, and two eighth notes. And everything except for the final eighth note is going to be a C, in which we are reiterating the C. And the last eighth note is going to be a C sharp or a D flat in this instance. I should have actually made this into a C sharp because that's the right way to write it, because we are going up from C to a D, and C sharp is what we find in the middle. Although D sharp is not is exactly the same note, we don't want to do that as a D flat. We tend to write D flat when we are going down from D, and C sharp when we go up from C. But right now I'm too lazy and I'm not going to go back and change this. But when you write this on your own, make sure you write it that way. And we're not making any modifications to the whole note D in the second measure. Let's see how this sounds like. First, without any improvisations, with the two whole notes playing, and the second time around you'll be hearing the chromatic single note addition along with the reiteration on measure 1. So it's time to apply the chromatic single note insertions to the next lines of Twinkle. As I mentioned earlier, the first time the G, G, F, F, E, E, D shows up, we're not gonna make any changes at all. No improvisations, we just play the plain version. And when we repeat that, we're gonna add the improvisation. So this shows like a additive or like a build-up effect to the song. So I'm not gonna go into too much detail on to like the reiterations that are happening here. We're only gonna focus on the chromatic note insertions that we're doing, which you can find on the last eighth note that is added on the first and third measures of the line at the bottom. So you could see a G flat that is added at the end of the first measure in line 2, which is the chromatic insertion for the walk down from G to F. So we've broken the G down into a quarter note and two eighth notes, the half note G into a quarter note and two eighth notes, and the two eighth notes, instead of playing two G's, we've replaced the second G with a G flat, and then we walk down back to F. And we could see the same thing happening again in measure 3. At the end of measure 3, we have replaced the last eighth note with an E flat, since the next note is a D and the previous note is a E. Both of these are chromatic half note insertions. and let's listen to the changes that are added here. So the first line is played without any improvisations added, and the repetition has the improvisations including the chromatic half note insertions. So how do you like it? I liked it a lot. I always love the chromatic intervals, and I think that it makes everything sound so funky. So now that we've gone through all of the changes and we've applied all of it, there's two more lines to the song, and I went ahead and applied similar improvisations to those lines. We're not going to go over that in detail, but let's listen to the entire song to see how it sounds like as a before and after. So I'm going to play the entire song with no improvisations, followed by all of the changes that we added. Okay, so that is the end of my first attempt to add improvisational techniques to a simple melody, and I'm actually glad how things turned out. And this is something that I have to keep practicing to make sure that my brain could work fast enough to add these improvisations live when I'm playing, because you can't always make preparations for improvisations and play the same things over and over. So we have to keep practicing to identify these patterns where these improvisations could be inserted, and also try to learn other techniques and add those as well. So the things that need to be done going forward are to make sure that your brain can recognize these and work fast enough to know what kind of improvisation needs to be added. And the second part is your hands. So your hands need to be familiar enough with these improvisations to be able to do that whenever the opportunity presents itself. And that's something that I look forward to practicing and developing as an ability. And I believe that this is something that will add to the performance and musicmanship of any musician that plays any instrument, not just limited to the accordion or the piano or a guitar. It could even apply to the vocals, as I mentioned before. I hope you found this video useful, And if you want more tutorials or performance videos on the accordion, or more tips about how you could buy an accordion, please subscribe to my channel, Breezy Bellows. You could find me on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok or Facebook page. And I will see you again with another video, hopefully another improvisation video, after I read more from that book. Until then, keep practicing.